for this kind of introduction. I will share my screen so I can start. Okay. So now you should see my first slide.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you again for this kind of introduction. Indeed, in this talk, so I'm honored to start this seminar series. And in particular in this talk, I would like to present an overview, a methodological overview on the application of complex networks to fluid flow systems. And in particular, the talk will include some contents of my PhD, in which, as Dixia pointed out, deal with wall-bound turbulence. And so let me start with the outline of the talk. So I will briefly introduce what complex networks are. Then we will move to the core of the presentation, where I will present the way in which flow data can be mapped into networks. And at the very end, I will draw some conclusion and present some generalization. So the aim of this talk is to provide a brief vademecum on network-based techniques for fluid dynamics problem, and I hope also this can be used as a toolbox for your future studies. Okay, so what are complex networks? Basically, networks are graphs, so they are made up of nodes, so discrete set of entities here represented as red points, which are connected by links, which are shown here as blue lines. So these are very simple example of graph. There are several variants of graphs. We can have this kind of undirected graphs where the direction of the link is not taken into account. So we basically check if a link is present or absent in between two nodes. Or we may account for the direction of the link, which is shown as these arrows. Or we can also account for weighted links or nodes, where we weight the intensity of the connection. So these are very simple example of graphs. But what happens if we increase the complexity of the graph? In this case, so we can say that complex networks are basically graphs that show non-trivial topological features, and that typically arise from real-world complex systems, and are typically very large in size. So they are made up of a very large number of nodes and links. This is an example of networks. This is a citation network. This is taken from the anniversary of Nature. And this graph shows each node represent different papers, and different colors are different research areas. And links are based on citation between different papers. So these are very nice visualization. Network science, we can say that emerged in the last, say, 2 decades, combining elements from graph theory and statistical physics. And in these 2 decades, network science has been mainly applied to study social behaviors, epidemic spreading, which is a very important topic nowadays, biology, economy, as well as transportation, and more recently also physical and flow systems. Just to grasp the concept, here I show you the cumulative number of documents as indexed by Scopus that contains keywords as complex networks or network analysis, compared with paper containing turbulence or turbulent flows, which is a more established field. And here you can see that indeed complex networks has a rapid increase in the last years. And here we can locate probably the first paper dealing with turbulence, which is 2009. But most of the works dealing with based on complex networks techniques in turbulence are in the 4 to 5 years. Okay, so this is the typical workflow of the physics-based approach. So we have our complex system, so our flow, which is mapped into a network. Then a set of measures is selected to study this network, and these measures are then interpreted to understand our complex system. The focus of this talk is in this first part of the workflow. So we'll see how we can map our system into a network. And I want to point out that this workflow is different from the typical architecture of machine learning, of neural network, because in this case we can define an input and output layer. So this is this is useful for prediction, for learning, while the aim of network science is to study the structure of the network. Okay. Just to say that for this part of the workflow, we will not see this part. So how can we study the network? So the measure, the metrics that are typically used, but you can refer to several review papers or books that present different metrics that are used to study networks. Okay, so let me move to the core of the presentation. So how can we map a flow, a turbulent flow, into a network? So in this talk, I would like to present the different techniques based on a node-based classification. So this classification is based on the different way in which nodes can be defined. In particular, here I show 3 different ways, which is, the first one is from temporal or spatial series to networks. The second one is a typical Euclidean point of view. And the third is a typical Lagrangian point of view. So we will see for each of these 3 approaches, how we can define nodes and links. So let me start with the first kind of approach, which is basically a signal analysis approach. Okay, so in this case, the idea is to map the signal, but of course, in this case, links do not represent a real connection. So there is not a real connection between nodes, but the aim is to map the signal, to extract information from the signal. And nodes can represent single observation or groups of data. These are 3 examples. So here, for example, we have very short signal. And in this first case, for example, we have 4 nodes, where basically we have 1 node for each observation. And different nodes are highlighted with different colors. Here we have 3 nodes, where nodes are grouped according to different quantile values. Or here we can have, for example, 2 nodes, and in this case, nodes are grouped as pairs, as consecutive pairs. So we can define nodes in different ways. So the idea is that to extract some signal, which typically are time series, from our flow. So from different points, we extract different signals. So the idea in this approach is to build 1 network for each signal. So at the very end, we obtain 1 network for each signal, or 1 network for each point in space, if we have time series, or 1 network for each time, if we are dealing with spatial series. Okay, but the point here is that we have one network for each signal. And there are 3 main approaches to build links. The first one is proximity networks. So basically, links are established if nodes are sufficiently close somehow. The other one is transition networks. So links are established by means of transition probabilities. And the last one is visibility graphs that exploit geometrical criteria. So let me start with the first one, proximity network. So here I show an example of signal. And here I grouped the values with different colors. So I grouped the values in pairs, okay? The idea here is to build a phase space. And in this case, we build a 2-dimensional phase space where each value in each pair correspond to a coordinate in the phase space. So for example, here, this pair in blue has these 2 values, which are 7 and 2. And indeed, the coordinate in the two-dimensional phase space are 7 and 2. Okay, so each pair here of the signal corresponds to a point in this phase space. Okay. When we build this such a phase space, we can establish connection based on proximity criteria. And one possibility is, for example, to use the so-called Epsilon Recurrence approach, where basically links are established between these nodes if they are sufficiently close in space, so they are within an epsilon radius. So, for example, the closest nodes to these nodes here in blue are these in pink and green. Okay, but it depends on the length of this epsilon value. Another possibility is to establish connection with the first k closest neighbors. Okay, so for example, the first 3 closest neighbors of this, again, a node here in blue, have this node here in green, this in pink, and this in yellow. Okay, so the idea here is, again, to build this phase space and exploit a proximity criterion in this phase space to build links. I just want to highlight here that there are different ways to build such a phase space. One possibility is, as done here in the example, to perform a time delay embedding. So we basically take 1 point every tau and with or without overlap. And in our example, I taken vector size 2, as we take in pairs, with tau equal to 1. So basically we take consecutive points with no overlap. Or another possibility is to use multiplier signal. So if you have a synchronized set of signal, you can build your phase space with this signal. Okay. So why proximity networks? The idea here is that each node represents a state of the system, and the proximity in the phase space is used to quantify similarity among nodes. So if these pairs here, which are our states of the system, highlighted with different colors, are close in the phase space, that means that there is some similarity between them. Indeed, if you look again at these 3 nodes here, which are close in the phase space, so the node in blue, in green, and in pink, they are close in the phase space, and they are indeed very similar states. So if you look at here, the node blue, in light green, and in pink. So the idea is to look at this recurrence of states in the system. In flow application, these proximity networks have been used to study jet and plumes, for example, turbulent combustor. There is a lot of literature on recurrence network in climate dynamics, so you can refer to Donner et al. 2011 to see applications of this climate dynamics. So here's an example of epsilon recurrence from acoustic pressure in a turbulent combustor. And the author here used indeed acoustic pressure, and you can see different signals, time series of acoustic pressure that are mapped into networks that clearly show different structures, different topologies. So to different signals correspond different networks. And the author used this technique, for example, to identify different dynamical regimes in the flow. Okay, so let me move to the second way to build networks from signal, which is based on transition probability. So this approach has its roots on Markov chain theory, where basically the transition matrices are interpreted as graphs. So in this case, again, a node represents a given state, just like for proximity networks, but links here are weighted, so are quantified by the probability of transition from one state to another state. So let me show it with an example. So this is an example of signal. Campagnaro et al. Proposed to divide the signal into quantized values. So here you can see 4 quantized values. And so the idea is to use this range of values, of quantized values as nodes, and count the number of times that the signal has a transition from one quantized values to another one. For example, here you can see there is a link from this node here in red to this in pink. Indeed, if you look at the signal, there are transition, for example, here from values in red to values in pink. The nice thing of this approach is that we can perform a signal reconstruction by performing a random walk on the network by exploiting this probability to have a transition from one quantized values to another one. Another way to build transition networks is by means of so-called ordinal partition transition networks. Okay, let me show again this approach with an example. So here we have our synthetic signal that I used as before. And the idea here is again to select a sequence of data. So in this case, I focused on a sequence of sites 3. So I basically select 3 values. And the idea is to assign an ordinal rank to these values. So here, the ordinal rank is 1 for value 13, because 1 indicates which is the maximum value for this set of 3 observations. 2 is the second value, and 3 is the lowest value. So we have this ranking order, which is 2, 3, 1. Again, because this is the middle value, this is the lowest value, this is the first value, okay? And by using this idea, if we select a sequence sites D, we can have d factorial possible ordinal combination. So in this case, we selected sequence sites equal to 3, so we can have 6 sequences, okay? And the idea here is that to use as nodes of the network such ordinal sequences, and again, links are quantified based on transition probabilities to switch from one ordinal sequence to another ordinal sequence. So this is the graph corresponding to this signal. And for example, here you can see that this state here that comprise observation 11, 12, and 15 as a transition to this other state, which is 3 to 3, 1, 2. 3, 1, 2 again, because it's the lowest value, this is the highest value, this is the middle value. Okay, so there is this transition from node 2, 3, 1 to node 3, 1, 2. Okay, so as you can see here, we have 6 nodes with any possibility, any combination of these 3 ranking order. Okay. A widely used approach in this context is when we fix d equal to 2. So we basically select only two values. So in this case, we have only 2 possibilities. We have 2 factorial, which is 2. So for one signal, we have only 2 possibilities of ordinal ranking. We can have that a signal is increasing or is decreasing. Okay, so in this case, 1, 2 is decreasing and 2, 1 is increasing. But in this, the interesting part here is that if we have a multivariate signal, so in this case, we have n equal to 2, so we have 2 signals, x and y. So if we look at these ordinal sequences here, we are basically looking at the local derivative. So we are looking at if the signal are increasing or decreasing, okay? So for example, here, both the signal are decreasing, here x is increasing and y is decreasing and so on, okay? And the idea behind this approach is now to use as nodes this combination of the sign of this multivariate signal. So in this case, we have 2 signals and we can have only 4 possibilities. So we can have that both x and y are increasing, x is increasing and y decreasing and so on, okay? And again, links are quantified based on the transition probability. So for example, in this case, both x and y are decreasing. So we are in configuration pi4. Then we have a transition to pi2 because x is increasing and y is decreasing. Then we have a transition to pi1 because both are increasing and so on, okay? Okay, so we can see here an example, a practical example with a Roselet system For the Rossless system, we have 3 multivariate signals. So in this case, we have 2 to the 3. So we have 8 nodes. So we have 8 possible configuration, and you can see here the corresponding transition network. And again, this approach is useful, for example, to look if there are forbidden connection, for example, here for pi 7. Okay, transition networks have been applied, for example, for jet plumes, for shear flows, and for turbulent combustor. It's interesting the approach of Shirazi that performed a signal reconstruction. And here you can see the comparison of the PDF of the velocity increments in a jet for different time delay, and also the structure function of order Q. And here you can see that indeed the reconstruction is quite good. Okay, so this brings me to the last way to build networks from signals, which is by means of visibility graphs. There are 2 main possibilities, which are natural visibility graphs or horizontal visibility graphs, which exploit 2 geometrical criteria. The first one is a convexity criterion, and the other is an ordering criterion. So again, let me show these approaches with an example. So here we have these signal with only 4 observations, and the idea behind natural visibility is to, let me make an analogy. So to interpret each value in the signal as a building, and basically there is a visibility between 2 points if you can basically see from the roof of one building to the roof of other buildings. So in this case, for example, if you put in this node 1, you can see the roof of node 2, you can see the roof of node 3, but you cannot see the roof of node 4 because there is the building 3 in between. Okay, so in this case, we have link with node 2 and node 3, but no link with node 4. Okay, the same happens for horizontal visibility, but in this case, you can basically only see in the horizontal direction. Okay. The nice part of horizontal visibility is that there are, since this is simpler than the natural visibility graph, there are analytical results for random series. But the common feature for the 2 approaches, typically hubs, network hubs, which are the most connected nodes, usually correspond to peaks in the signal, because if you are in a higher position in the signal, you are more likely to see other points in the series. Other really nice properties of visibility graphs is that they are invariant under horizontal and vertical scaling of the axis. So you basically, if you multiply or add a constant to the signal, the intervisibility doesn't change. A really important property is that visibility graphs are sensitive to the structure of the signal, both linear and nonlinear. For example, if you have, again, a time series, this is the PDF. If you perform a shuffling of the signal, how is now the PDF? The PDF is the same, but your visibility graphs will be definitely different. Okay. So visibility graphs can retain important information of the structure of the signal. Okay. And the last property of visibility graph is that they are parametric free. So you basically have your signal, you apply your visibility algorithm, and you will obtain your network without tuning any parameter. Okay. Visibility graphs have been widely employed to study jets and plumes, also turbulent combustor, two-phase flows, and we also use it in wall turbulence. For example, in my PhD, we studied velocity signal in a turbulent channel flow. And here you can see that indeed different velocity signals at different wall normal coordinates correspond to different visibility graphs. Another approach, again, from my PhD thesis, is to study concentration and mass transport of passive scalar, which are emitted in a turbulent boundary layer. Okay. Okay, so this concludes the first part of the talk. I don't know if you prefer to ask questions now or at the very end, but if you have questions, you can ask. Okay, so this brings me to the second part of the of how we can map flow data into network, which is from the Julian point of view. Okay, so let me show this movie. So in this movie, I show the 24-hour real-time flights across North America, where each flight is shown with a different color. Here you can see his time. So now is night in the East Coast and evening in the West Coast. So now is morning in the East Coast, so you can see the rapid increase of the number of flights, but it's still night in the West Coast. But now is morning also in the West Coast, so the number of flights is increasing again. And I showed you this video because this kind of information is really important if you want to model or understand the spreading of an epidemic. So in these times, this kind of information are really useful. So the idea behind Julian approach is that nodes, in this case, correspond to fixed spatial locations. So in this figure or in the movie, nodes correspond to airports, okay? And they are fixed in space. Links, in this case, can represent physical connections. So for example, the flights among airports, as we have seen in the movie. And an example of approach from flow system is this performed by Giacomo et al., in which nodes correspond to position in the surface, in the Earth's surface, and a link is established by using particle tracer that move from one location to another location, okay? And the authors used this approach to study mixing regions in the Mediterranean Sea, okay? Another approach, similar approach, is recently performed by Perron et al., which is recently accepted. The idea here is again to study mixing, but in a turbulent channel flow setup. And again, nodes here correspond to fixed location, correspond to different levels at different one normal coordinates, shown here with different layer colors. And again, particle trajectories are used to establish connection in time, over time, between different nodes. Okay, another way to build links is by means of a functional network. In this case, functional network can be defined in different ways. So again, we can have proximity networks. Again, if nodes are sufficiently close, vorticity networks based on vorticity-induced velocity, correlation networks, or synchronization networks. So now we see each of these in detail. So but again, proximity networks, in proximity networks, links are basically established if nodes are sufficiently close in space. So the point here is that nodes represent fixed spatial location, and there is a connection if they are within a given proximity threshold. Another way to build proximity networks is to use the so-called Gabriel graph criterion, where basically two nodes are linked if any other node is outside this circle whose diameter is the distance between the two nodes. So in this case, these two nodes are linked because this node is outside this circle, but in this case, they are not linked. Okay. And proximity networks have been used in the context of fluid dynamics to study optical wakes, the dispersion processes, or turbulent combustors. So, for example, Kruger et al. Used a proximity criterion to classify different optical flows in presence of stretching of the flow. Or, for example, Fellini et al. Used this proximity network in which to study dispersion, spreading of a process or dispersion of contaminants in the atmosphere, where basically nodes correspond to crossroads and links are basically the roads between different crossroads. Okay, an interesting way to build special networks is by means of the Biosaver Law. So the Biosaver Law, we can exploit the vorticity and the velocity induced by vorticity. So in this case, again, nodes correspond to fixed spatial location, and the link intensity between two locations is quantified proportionally to the velocity induced by vorticity. Okay. And this approach is widely used, for example, to study jet and plumes, isotropic turbulence, as well as optical wakes or turbulent combustor. And for example, in this case, this approach, these vorticity networks, are used to perform to reduce the complexity of the flow by means of so-called community detection. So the authors basically were able to identify this coherent structure to perform a reduced order model of the system, and then the authors were able to predict, to reconstruct the loads in the cylinder here that produce the wake with good accuracy, even if they use a reduced order model. Okay, so a large category of spatial networks comprise so-called correlation networks. So again, we extract a signal from our flow, but in this case, is different from signal analysis, because in signal analysis, we have one network for each signal, while in this case, we have one network for the entire flow. And in this case, instead, time series are used to compute a given statistical parameter, that can be linear, for example, Pearson correlation or Spearman correlation, as well as nonlinear quantities such as transfer entropy or mutual information. So the idea is to exploit time series here to build a statistical dependence parameter. So here you can see an example of a correlation matrix, for example, and this kind of matrices are typically very large because you have a lot of number of positions, spatial positions, so these matrices are quite large. And one possibility is to retain only the largest values, so the strongest correlations, by performing a filtering operation. And in this case, we build link only by taking only the highest correlation values. We use this approach again to study turbulent channel flow, numerical simulation of turbulent channel flow, where nodes represent fixed spatial location in the domain, and again, and links are built by filtering correlation coefficient. Another approach. Another application is in climate dynamics, where nodes represent again position in the Earth's surface, and links are established based on this cross correlation between atmospheric variables. And it's interesting because the author are able to identify this longer range connection, called teleconnection, between very distant points in the Earth's surface. Another approach, another possibility is to perform, to use the information from complex networks to perform control strategies. So in this case, the authors build correlation network in this turbulent combustor, and they use the information on this coherent structure to perform passive control strategies. And you can see here in the figure on the right that indeed the control strategy is effective, or here in the reduced intensity of the pressure oscillation. As you can see, the correlation networks have been widely used, for example, again, for isotopic turbulence, Ross turbulence, climate variability, as well as turbulent combustors. Okay, so this brings me to the last way to build special networks, which is synchronization networks. In this approach, this approach has its roots on dynamical system theory. So for example, from the Kuramoto model to study the synchronization on complex systems. And indeed, it has application in, for example, in communication or biological systems. For fluid flows, here the idea is that to build synchronization networks by looking at the synchronization between events that appear in different signals. So for example, we can define an event as an extreme occurrence of value, as highlighted here in green, in the green box. So the idea to quantify links is to count the number of times that an event appear, for example, in a given signal called X, after or before it appears in another signal Y with a given time lag tau. So the idea is to quantify links based on the fact that synchronization is strong enough between two signals. Again, I recall that these signals are typically taken from different points in space, which correspond to different nodes. And this kind of approach is typically used in climate applications, where again, nodes correspond to geographical locations. And here you can see a very nice visualization of this kind of application where the author used synchronization networks. Here you can see the links starting from this position in space. So these lines correspond to the links with this position here. And you can see again this teleconnection, so this longer range connection, which are an effect of this large scale motion in the atmosphere, such as Rossby waves. Okay, behind, I would like just to mention other approaches in this category that combine networks with other techniques, such as proper orthogonal decomposition. For example, here Nair, Branton, and Tyra used the temporal coefficients of the modes, or the POD modes, to establish connection between different modes, where in this case, mode pairs correspond to nodes, as you can see here in the figure, and they use the linear regression to establish links. Okay, so this brings me to the last way to build complex networks from flow system, which is from the Lagrangian point of view. In this case, as you may imagine, nodes are not fixed position in space as for the Julian approach, but they are moving objects. So for example, they are fluids or solid particles. And links are quantified if there is a similarity or an exchange of information among particles. Okay. Have been proposed mainly three different ways to build Lagrangian networks. Again, a proximity network, proximity-based criterion is used. So here you can see in the figure that you have three different particles with their trajectories. And again, basically links are established if particles come sufficiently close in space at a given time. This kind of approach is something like contact tracing, which is really useful nowadays to trace contacts between persons. Another way to build networks is by means of a similarity-based networks. This is similar to functional network in the case of the Julian approach. So in this case, for example, we can define a similarity between trajectories by quantifying the standard deviation of the distance between particle trajectories. So the idea in this case is that to look if trajectories are similar. So in this case, a particle in red and particle in blue comes several times close in space, but as you can see, the trajectory of particle in red is really different with respect to the trajectory of particle in blue, but particle in blue is more similar to particle in green, even if particle in green is not so close to the particle in blue. So these are two different ways to look at, to build links. And again, as for Julian networks, we can use the Biosaver Law to build a vorticity network, where in this case, we have point vortices that move in the flow. So they are tracked in a Lagrangian way in the flow. And again, these point vortices induces a velocity in other location of the flow, which is again exploited to quantify links. And this kind of approach have been mainly used for vertical flow analysis, but also, for example, for Weyl-Benard convection, again for geophysical flows and wall-bounded turbulence in particular. In wall-bounded turbulence in my PhD thesis, we again exploited the same DNS. We exploited DNS or turbulent channel flow to study mixing, where we established links if particles in the domain are sufficiently close in space over time. And in this case, we were able to clearly identify different characteristic regimes of the dynamics of the particles. In this case, for example, in green, we have a advection dominated regime, while in the last part, we have a mixing dominated regime. Lagrangian-based networks have been used also to identify coherent structures. So here you can see an example for the bike-lane jet, or as I mentioned before, for Weyl-Benard convection. And here you can see that Lagrangian trajectory clusters, which are highlighted with different colors here in the bottom panel, corresponds to turbulent superstructures in the temperature field. Okay. Okay, so this concludes the different ways in which flow data have been used to build networks so far. Some generalization. There are several generalization. Here I focus, probably this is the principal generalization for networks, which is multi-layer networks. So the idea behind multi-layer network is to combine different networks into different layers. So in one layer of this multi-layer structure correspond to a network, as you can see in the figure, and we can have basically two possibilities. Here on the left, we have that in each layer, we have different nodes. So for example, imagine that here you have spatial networks. So in this case, for each layer, we have that each node corresponds to a different spatial position in the, for example, in the Earth's surface, but different nodes correspond to different geographical location. Okay, so there is a sort of heterogeneity in the nodes for in each layer. Okay, while in this case, we call this configuration a multiplex network, where in this case, nodes are exactly the same entities in each layer. So in this case, for example, we can have that, again, nodes correspond to geographical location, but the idea is that in each layer, in each network, the nodes correspond to the same locations, okay? This is also the case of signal analysis. because in signal analysis, for example, here is that the visibility approach, we may have a multivariate set of signals. So for example, we have a set of synchronized signals, and we build a network for each signal here, again, for example, by using a visibility graph. So in each layer, we have different networks, but since nodes correspond to temporal observation, we have the same nodes correspond to the same times. So this is a multiplex network. And the possibility is to use, again, multivariate signal to build these multiplex networks, but instead of using visibility graphs, for example, you can use recurrence network. So the idea is that to build this phase space for each signal, and again, check this proximity criterion in the phase space, and build the corresponding graph for each layer, okay? In the context of fluid flows, multi-layer networks have been poorly investigated. There is this recent application from the group of Gao that used multi-channel measurements to study transition in a two-phase flows from a bubble to a slug flow. Okay, so this brings me to the conclusions. In this talk, I provided a synthetic overview of the main network-based approach in fluid dynamics. So I started from a node-based classification, and we explored the different ways in which links can be constructed. By looking at the applications of these on complex networks, we can see that this is a promising technique, for example, for reducers of the modeling or identification of coherent structure, as well as signal characterization, for example, in terms of extreme events, as well as to identify dynamical transition, or also to aid the targeting of control strategies. Of course, so in this talk, I presented a methodological overview. So we recently had a paper that is a review on application of these network techniques to turbulent and vertical flows, which have been recently accepted. What emerges from this overview is that complex networks are highly versatile, but the present taxonomy of methodologies is not intended to be exhaustive, because basically novel variants continuously appear day by day. So the idea was to give you a taste of what has been done so far in order to stimulate further advancements. Because I think there is a whole new world to discover out there, which is network science for fluid dynamics, and we just need to explore it. I just want to promote this seminar series, this brand new seminar series on network science for fluid dynamics that will start in November, as organized by Nair, Mina, and Tyra. And if you want more info and registration, you can refer to this website. So thank you very much for your kind attention, and I'm glad to answer your questions.
Okay, thanks, Giovanni, for this very detailed, also like an introductory and like overview of the networks, complex networks, and their connection to the fluid flows. So right now, let's open the floor to to the questions from the from the audience. You can just raise your voice to ask questions.
I would have a question.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Marco, and thank you, Dr. Fan, for organizing these seminars, and thanks, Giovanni, for the very interesting presentation. I have a couple of questions. I've never, this is the first time that I hear about complex networks, so my questions are going to be very basic. Yep. And so if I understand correctly, we define with network analysis, we take whatever we have in terms of an experimental measurement or a numerical simulation, and we analyze the data by creating a network. So we define nodes, which can be like a phase of the flow, or location, or the particle. And then we define the links, and then we look at the network itself that we have built based on these criteria. Okay, so how does this, what are the advantages of this type of analysis compared to more standard, or like type of visualization and analysis of the results?
Yeah, this is a really nice question. It's a typical question. And the answer is that, of course, it depends on which, okay, let me show this part of this resume. So the idea is, if you, the answer, it depends on which branch of this application we are looking for. So for example, just to give you some examples of successful results. For example, for time series analysis, there are, as I mentioned, for visibility graphs, for example, they are able to retain the structure of the signal, which are maybe lost in other techniques. So imagine, for example, if you only look at your PDF, for example, you lose the information on the correlation structure. But if you look at the spectra, amplitude spectra, maybe you lose information on the phase, and so on. So the idea is that using these kind of techniques, maybe you retain information that are lost by other techniques. An application, for example, a promising application is the point of view Lagrangian point of view that some authors here, I can show you here again. For example, in these applications, for example, here we were able to identify this regime here in a clear way, and by means of other techniques, it's not so easy to clearly identify these regimes. Or, for example, here in the case of Rayleigh-Benard convection, here you can see these ridges here, which are the finite time Lyapunov exponent. And you can see that these ridges here are not able to identify these turbulent superstructures because they are so, they are much smaller than the typical size of the turbulent superstructure. So the authors, in this case, were able to identify this, let me say, coherent structure, large scale coherent structure for this time scale. That, for example, by means of finite time Lyapunov exponent, you were not able to clearly identify. So, of course, it depends on case by case. And this is the way I say I would like to promote these kind of techniques, because it's a very recent approach. So we need to explore also this comparison between this approach and other approaches.
Right. So these complex networks are able to retain way more information than other techniques.
Yeah, is different information.
Different information.
Because it depends on what you are looking for. Because if you are looking for your PDF, it's enough your PDF, basically.
Right. Yeah.
So it depends on what you want to study.
Mm-hmm. And how expensive are these techniques in computational?
Again, it depends on the different approaches. Typically, Julian-based approach are more expensive than, for example, time series approaches, because as I mentioned, for correlation networks, in this case, when you study special networks, you usually have a large number of nodes that can be, for example, a large number of grid positions or position in the Earth surface. And this increases the size of the network, and in turn, the computational time. For signal analysis, usually signal analysis are not so expensive. So again, it depends on the algorithm. So there are, for example, there are several optimization algorithms that, for example, for visibility graphs, let you compute visibility graphs in a very fast way. Or, for example, again, for Julian, for special networks, so in the category of a Julian approach, there are some techniques that let you to reduce the size of the network, retaining the information on the network. Okay, so there are at least a couple of ways to reduce the complexity of the problem.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Any more questions? I do have two questions for you, Giovanni. So recently NSF have started a new funding model called a Convergence Funding. And one of the convergence, big funding is called a Smart Ocean, which is like Internet of Things for Ocean. And which trying to promote a lot of buoy, around the world, and to understanding the all kinds of ocean signals so I can see a lot of interesting application in terms of complex networks to applying these problems. However, so in your an introduction, I understand very well, not understand very well, but understand to some degree that is able to detect the abnormality of the problem. But here's if you go to slides 49, let's just using this a picture as example. 49.
Sorry.
49.
Yeah. This one.
49. Sorry. 49.
Oh, sorry. There are no 49.
Oh, just in your 49 in your conclusion this.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Using this just okay. Beautiful pictures this.
Okay.
So one thing for fluid flow is I think a special temporal information. So you see or you show a lot of these temporal information can be very compactly to represent a through complex network. So another thing is all these node spatial information. Where do you pick these nodes, especially in the Eulonian perspective? For example, you have sensors. We cannot have sensors in a million places in the world. We can have sensors in sparse places. How are you able to pick these sensor locations? This is the first question. The second question is that I would just ask the second question it's coherently. So if to some degree, say in this a complex network of the analysis, you find there's some missing information that I'm not able to extract with the current data point I have. Is there a way that say, oh, I want to put another sensor location or couple sensor location, different area in the way to enhance our fidelity or enhance our confidence in terms of the understanding the reduced order model of the system? So that's the two questions I have, Giovanni.
Yeah, thank you for these questions. Are really interesting questions. The point is that okay, what it is usually done is that you usually have more information and you try to reduce the information by selecting the most interesting position. So the idea is that you have a lot of measurement points where you measure your data, and you want to select the most useful, perhaps the most significant location where you will have a sparse set of data. The opposite, to the best of my knowledge, so far has not been done. So you can do that because, for example, you can have your, let me show, for example, let me use this example here. So you have these nodes, and maybe you can use community detection algorithm as for, in this case, so let me show a practical example here from this work from Mina, Nair, and Tahira. So here you have high dimensional system because you have your wake, which is over your cylinder, and you have measurement in basically each point past your cylinder. So you can build these vorticity networks, okay, by linking different positions here in the wake, but you can recognize by means of this community detection from the network that this group of nodes behave in a similar way. So it is useless to have 100 point, for example, 1,000 point here, but you think this community as a unique entity, okay? And at the very end, you have a reduced network. So you have a smaller network. So in this case, the idea is that you select the most useful points, for example, by using this community detection algorithm, or you may select, for example, the hubs in the network. So you say, okay, my hubs, the most connected nodes, are the most important, and the other one I can remove them because they are useless. And in this case, you say, okay, these are the location of my flow that are worth to measure, are worth to use to measure my data. If you want to say, okay, I want to add another location to improve, yeah, I think you can do that, but to be honest, I don't know how. I mean, so far we have seen only this kind of approach where you have more information and you try to reduce the information. If you want to add some information, I think you can do that, but to be honest, I don't know how.
So just follow up, like, say, so there's at least to the best of the knowledge right now, there's no guideline to add a new point to, like, to increase the confidence of, like, the information, like, of the fluid mechanics, the spatial temporal information. So for basically a little bit like active learning. However, like, while you're talking, this just like give me some, like, idea. So basically, it seems to be like a very good way, so a little bit like a transfer learning. Say basically you have a huge simulation or even low fidelity to actually to, like, to give a guideline to where to put, like, the sensor point, or, like, you say buoy in the, like, this big vast ocean to the real world, like, to, like, say to in the way, like, say, instead of put, like, two, like, buoy in the Mediterranean Sea, let's put one buoy at the Mediterranean and one buoy at, like, the North Sea of, like, Norway. So, like, is that, like, what you're, like, thinking about, like,
yeah,
is that, like, my characterization correct?
Yeah, it's what I said before. It depends on how you build your network, because there are a lot of ways to define your network. So it depends on how you build your network, how the structure of the network is able to retain the information from sparse data, so you can use this information to other more real application. So again, you can refer. There are several techniques, not only to map flow system into. Again, let me show this. So there are several techniques to map the network, but also there are several ways to measure the structure of the network. And by using these different measures, you can select which are the most representative, the most useful information from your network. So this part is not counted in this talk, but again, there are, once you build your network, there are a huge number of ways you can measure information in your network and use this information for your purpose. So to, I don't know, to decide if you want to use one node or another node to do your measurement. So, and this is I think this is also the power of, I mean, the key point of complex networks is their versatility. So they are really versatile because you can use them basically as you want, but you be careful because you be aware what you are doing, because you have always be focused on what you want to study and which is the information you want to extract from the system. Then you can try different network representation or different network measures.
Yep. Thanks, Giovanni. So I think our time is running short. I think maybe a lot of people will have a question in terms how to connecting the physics of the problem and these networks that's a core issue for a lot of artificial intelligence, in terms application wise. But to all the audience who are interested in that, as in the like email actually included like Giovanni's like email address, and you can just like send him email like to connect, and like maybe even sending like Zoom links to like to hang out, like to enjoy like the nice background like triggering like Giovanni has like in his background. So so with that, like I want to like close for the first session of our seminars, like and I want to thank like Giovanni again, like give him a virtual like plot, like to some degree. So and thanks for all the audience to like joining. And just one last thing is like this session will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube, and like I will send the links to everybody like after like we after I confirm with Giovanni. So thanks again for your time, and I'm looking forward to see you next week. Bye bye.
Thank you very much. Can I